What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Dragon's Dogma 2, the highly anticipated sequel to a cult classic from several years ago, by which I mean more than a decade in 2012. And while the game is a definite improvement in certain areas, I also think other parts of it leave me with mixed feelings, which we'll dive into, obviously. To get my usual stuff out of the way first, though, I review games after 100% to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link to everything I covered down in the description below, as well as a link to my public Steam profile. Now, in the case of this title in particular, a few extra notes. One, I did not get a review copy, so this is coming out a bit after its initial launch, a week or so. And during this game's launch, it got hit pretty hard by performance issues and people upset about the microtransactions. Now, we're going to get into both of those things. Of the two, I think the performance issues are more notable, but make no mistake, I'm not a fan of the microtransactions either. We're going to talk about the microtransactions specifically a bit more towards the end of the review, as it makes more sense to cover them once I've talked about how the rest of the game works, and performance we'll get into shortly. But besides those two things, I will say that Dragon's Dogma 2 was an overall shorter game than I thought it was going to be. My initial run came in at just under 27 hours, and that was with me doing most everything I could, then hopping into New Game Plus to finish off everything else, including the other ending. Now, broadly speaking, Dragon's Dogma 2 is an open-world action RPG where we take on the role of the Arisen, the one destined to either stop the dragon or die trying, who is accompanied by otherworldly travelers known as pawns that aren't exactly human or anything. They lack a lot of self-determination, if you will, and they comprise the rest of our party. One of them being your permanent main pawn, and the rest of them changing in and out pretty frequently with other characters' pawns, which forms this game's version of a multiplayer, though it is largely a single-player game. You don't even need to be connected to the network at all for that, as the game will fill them in with generic pawns instead. And using this formula, which was also present for the original title, I would say they improved upon the bulk of it without really trying to expand or broaden their horizons, really. If anything, I still think the scope of Dragon's Dogma 2 is a bit limited in what it tries to accomplish, especially with things like side content, which is what gives me those mixed feelings. So, let's actually dive into the rest of the game and start breaking some of that down. First up, we have the technical state of the game. I'm sure many people have heard about the performance issues this game has, and I can share some of my own experiences with those things, some of which has been confirmed by the publisher Capcom themselves. Personally, running on a very high-end PC, I'll have the specs in the About section, I should remember to do that, but just about the best computer you could buy on a consumer level, I still ran into issues, primarily in town hubs. It would kind of tank the FPS and I would get a lot of stuttering in towns, and apparently this has to do with each individual NPC taking up more of your CPU usage than it actually should, so hopefully they get that fixed, but it's a very confirmed and prevalent problem. Otherwise, running around the rest of the world was usually pretty flawless from a performance standpoint, with most of what I ran into being minor bugs like minor visual glitching, things going into walls, stuff like that. But occasionally, I would run into a more serious problem, typically with very large enemies. Dragon's Dogma, as a franchise, sees you battling often very large enemies, and I noticed that if you got them into a space where they shouldn't be, or if you're near a small confined space, sometimes those large enemies would try to enter that, and it would just mess the game up. As you can see with this footage where I was fighting this dragon, and it got stuck in this building. This went on for a few minutes before it finally just glitched out and stopped moving and let me beat it to death. I also ran into an issue with the fast travel aux carts in the game, sometimes glitching out and just like freaking out in the middle of the road type of thing. Those aren't a huge deal, as you can usually skip that kind of thing or just, get out of it. But still, the kind of thing you might want to expect. However, I was playing this on PC, and I've got to tell you that the keyboard and mouse control isn't bad by any means. I play pretty much everything with keyboard and mouse, even if it suggests using a controller, which is the case here. My main gripe is mostly that all of the keys are not fully rebindable, and realistically, I think they would fix all of their problems with PC controls if they just fully let you rebind the keys. You're only allowed to use certain keys which makes using things like my custom keypad more difficult. And while it's still very playable, it's just a minor thing they could do to really help out the PC version of this, because if you're going to bring a game to PC, I do think you should be making an effort to properly utilize the controls for that platform. But I admit that's mostly a me problem, so not a huge deal. Mostly though, there are some performance issues that you do need to be aware of before purchasing this, I think. And with that, let's keep it moving. Next up, let's talk difficulty and New Game Plus. Now, this game does not technically have any sort of difficulty. I just wanted to mention this, that the game is set. Enemies are what they are. But as this is an RPG, you're going to be progressing through the game, increasing your stats, leveling up. So there is a bit of a break point for the difficulty of the game as a whole. For me, that was around level 40. New Game Plus does not increase monster stats or anything. It's just the same game again with all of your previously acquired stuff, which actually makes it easier, while also allowing you to run through and see the things you haven't seen before. I'm fine with that. The big monsters have a ton of health anyway, and there's a lot of room to optimize and really craft your build, but I will say that this game doesn't really have an endgame like the original title's Dark Arisen expansion gave it with Bitter Black Isle, and thus the point at which you're playing this game and going like, oh, I think I've seen pretty much everything, comes faster than you might expect. Moving right along to character creation though. So when you fire this up and start a new game, after a quick intro, you'll be given the character creator. Right away though, I want to explain that as of right now, you can only make one character. Capcom has taken note of everyone's displeasure of this and is working on allowing you to do things like start a new game after you've already began the game. But right now at the time of this review, once you create a character, you're locked in, which I'm not a big fan of. I don't mind the single character save for each character, but only being able to make one character or not be able to start a new game really sucks for an RPG. The original title, while also only having one save per character, would let you start a new game though, as an example. Nonetheless, when you get started with character creation, you can start from an initial template or you can fully customize a new character. They released a character creator separately for this game and it is pretty impressive. You can do just about anything you want with this thing and really customize the granular detail of the cosmetic portion of character creation. You can technically pick between being human or beastren, though because the character creator is what it is, I think it would be pretty easy to roleplay that you are one of the elves if you really wanted to, as they also make an appearance in-game. And while I don't really want to belabor this point, because honestly it's not that interesting to me personally, as cosmetic character creators go, I think they did a really good job here. The most important choice from a role-playing perspective you're going to make here, outside of just, visual interpretation, is your starting vocation. You'll be able to pick between fighter, mage, thief, or archer. And this is going to determine your starting experience, and thus it's a pretty big choice. This determines what kind of equipment you're going to get, what skills you can use, the usual stuff. If you want to pick the easier to play options, you probably want to go thief or archer, as fighter is going to see you up in the fray a lot, and while I enjoy it personally, it's not for everybody. And then mage is really more of a support role until you get the advanced sorcerer vocation, which is more damage focused magic. Though mage can certainly do damage in the beginning, I just find it's usually better support than damage. Now, technically speaking, this doesn't happen at character creation, but a short ways into the game, you will also be able to fully customize and create your own main pawn. This is like your direct companion or assistant, if you will, and they will also be with you for the rest of the game. They can cover any basic gaps in your coverage. For instance, I like to pick fighter for my main guy, and then my pawn I like to keep as a mage for all of their support magic. We're going to talk more about the pawn system here in a little bit in a more dedicated fashion, though I did want to mention it here, that you will create a pawn as well. That, though, brings us to our story setup and my thoughts on it. Now, initially, I thought they might manage to do something cool here, but truth be told, while the setup is interesting and I liked the initial premise, I do think the back half of the story gets really bad. To talk about the story of this, you need to understand the universe of Dragon's Dogma a little bit. Simply put, there's a big old dragon, it marks the Arisen, which is you in this case, and it is the Arisen's job to track down and kill the dragon or die trying. Being marked as the Arisen causes the pawns to see you as their leader and do basically whatever you tell them to do. I don't want to spoil this for anybody else who hasn't played the original title and know where this winds up going, so you might just want to skip ahead from here if you haven't. But ultimately, that dichotomy between the Arisen and the dragon leads to a choice, which makes up the core of how this universe works. As a result of that, the story of Dragon's Dogma 2 can really only go so many places, and the initial setup I thought was interesting and might try to change something, but it devolves into something pretty bland pretty quickly. Now, Dragon's Dogma 2 starts off with you in jail being called upon yourself and not the Arisen. A short ways into the game, you find out that you were marked by the dragon, and the current ruler of the realm, Vermund, finds out about this, has you cursed to lose all of your memory and sent to prison so people would forget about you so she can install her son as the ruler as well, because typically the Arisen takes the throne. And while the dragon's been around, nobody could find the Arisen until you show back up after escaping prison and reclaim your memories learning about all of this. As such, you spend a pretty significant portion of the game dealing with that exact situation. There's a false Arisen on the throne, you need to deal with that so you can then deal with the dragon. And like I said, I thought they might take this someplace interesting or do something new with it, but they don't. This entire setup that I've just mentioned to you winds up not being a factor at all. You get to the end of the game, it's the exact choice you knew was coming if you've played the first game, and while there is a true ending with an extra section I'll touch on briefly here in a moment, nothing I just mentioned has any impact on that particular moment. So what little bit new stuff they did add to the universe isn't affected by the bulk of this game's story, which means why am I doing this? Which felt like this huge wasted opportunity. And then that comes in with some pretty bland storytelling towards the back half anyways. For instance, and this is marketing, so I wouldn't even consider this a spoiler, but the big enemy they showed off in the marketing, giant walking statue you've got to fight. The fight itself is whatever. It's cool. Knew it was coming from the marketing, obviously. But what bothered me about this scenario is that what they didn't tell you in the marketing is that this statue isn't fighting you. It's not even after you. It's after your enemy, the antagonist of the game. So when this thing initially appeared and I realized what it was doing, my very first thought was, why would I want to kill this thing? It is only helping me. In fact, it runs into people, and my first thought was, oh, maybe they want you to save these towns that are going to be collateral damage. But no, the towns that it's destroying are the people that imprisoned you at the start of the game. So as a character, what is my motivation to kill this thing in this narrative that they're trying to spin, other than, oh, look at that big enemy, which is what the pawns do. They're like, oh my god, we got to stop this giant enemy. And they just keep repeating that over and over again. And while this makes for a great set piece, narratively, I thought it was very stupid. And what's more, having played video games for quite a while, I noticed that this thing was legitimately marching across the map. So in my head, I was like, I bet I don't actually have to fight this thing. I bet there's some sort of scripted event that keeps this from getting out of control. So combined with the fact that I just didn't want to fight the thing initially, at least on my first playthrough, as there is an achievement you need to get for it, so on my second playthrough I did that. But first playthrough, I was like, I don't want to fight this thing, and I bet I don't have to. So I just went and rested at a camp, at which point a scripted event plays where this thing dies. As a plot point, I hated this. Now, the other part of the story I wanted to touch on was the bit at the end. Again, not really going to spoil anything, but just some general notes here. There are two endings to this title, primarily. A bad and a good ending, if you will. The true ending, if you want to put it that way, gives you a sort of epilogue that you have to play through that sees you trying to accomplish a few specific objectives. However, unlike the rest of the game, if you die right here, you have to start it over from the beginning. Now, every few days, as an event passes, you'll start from that checkpoint, but there is no saving. And so I learned that the hard way because there's some gear that only pops up in this specific portion of the game that I purchased, only to die to one of the fights here and find out that I didn't just restart from my last autosave, I restarted from the beginning of this event, which a little bit of warning about would have been nice. I would have played a little bit differently, and obviously I did afterwards, but it was an incredibly annoying mechanic to approach what was effectively the end of the game and suddenly change how I can load and save. So all in all, with the story, it starts off well enough, but I was just not a fan. I didn't go into this expecting some grand story. Again, I've played the first game. I knew how this was probably going to end because of how the universe works, but the story is just not good here. They very much so missed the mark, in my opinion. That, though, brings us to the progression systems. As we're traveling through the world, fighting off all sorts of monsters, we're going to be making some pretty standard RPG progress in the forms of levels, vocations, gears, and upgrades. In addition to just ourselves, our main pawn will also be accumulating these things. More on them in just a moment. Now, levels are pretty straightforward. As you gain experience, you will gain levels, which leads to increased stats. Just like the previous game, the vocation that you level up in determines some of your stat growth. This is important because later on you can change vocations pretty freely and master them to get extra permanent abilities that you can use whenever. However, what vocation you level up in does affect your stats. Which brings us to the vocations. Not so much on the individual ones, we'll talk a little bit more about that in combat, but I want to speak a little more broadly about how they work. Now, every vocation, and there are quite a few of them beyond the starting ones that you'll have to track down and find, offers a playstyle. It determines what weapons and armor you can equip, alongside what skills you can use. But first, let's talk about the skills and everything. As you play in the role of a vocation, you'll earn ranks for it. As you rank up, you'll earn more and more access to the abilities and augments available for that particular vocation. As you kill enemies, you'll also gain a secondary currency called discipline. This is what you spend to earn those augments, skills, and abilities. You spend them typically at an inn, but not always. Sometimes it's like the vocation place in individual towns. But you find the NPC that can do this for you, and then you spend discipline on the things you want. Of the skills available to your vocation, you can have up to 4 of them equipped, and that's going to lead to your playstyle within your individual vocation. Then we have augments. Augments are permanent passives that once earned can be used in any vocation. These are how you're going to get the permanent upgrades and buffs to anything you want to do, and incentivizes you to mix up and try different vocations here and there. Now, you can only equip so many of these at once as well, which means there is a limit to how useful these are. And thus, generally, if you want to see if a vocation has anything useful for you, in the long term, you just want to check out their list of augments and see if it's better or does anything extra that you want specifically, and then you can level up that vocation until you get that augment and then, move on. As I mentioned though, your vocations determine what kind of gear you can use, which comes down to your weapons and thus how they attack and fight, or in the Trickster's case, you don't deal any direct damage. Gear obviously increases a bunch of stats, though I will say gear progression is pretty linear. As you move through the map, you're going to be kind of moving around the coast, if you will, and each town as you go has progressively better equipment that could realistically be organized into like tiers. So despite there being an equipment upgrade system, the best items obviously come in the late game, and outside of just generally better stats, they also have other side effects as well. For instance, some weapons for the fighter have more knockdown power, which means they're more likely to knock down enemies, and some particular types of armor prioritize one type of defense over another, such as magic or physical. But because all of this is limited by your vocation anyway, there tends to be a best-in-slot type of situation here. However, you can still upgrade all of your gear. You go to either the armor vendor or the weapons dealer, and you can enhance your equipment. This is actually a little interesting. There are 3, I would say, main settlements in the game. Vermund, Sacred Arbor, which is the elves, and Batal, which are the Beastren. Depending on where you get these items upgraded, the exact stats of the upgrade will change a little bit. I didn't find this noticeable enough to really care much about it, but technically speaking, you can customize exactly which stats are getting increased via this option. Now, the very last upgrade you can give your equipment, which requires the 3 previous upgrades, is Worm's Fire. Once you get to the point in the game where you find the Dragon Forged, which is a specific NPC, they can upgrade your weapons to this tier. This requires a special material that you get from battling the dragons out in the world. That material plus already upgraded equipment allows you to upgrade it to that last stage, which is the most important one because it does things like half the item's weight, which can affect your carry capacity, which is huge. As a result, the best gear in the game is, of course, the stuff that comes at the very end of it, upgraded and forged in Dragon's Fire, as it were, which gives you a nice sense of progression, I think. Now, a form of sort of side progression, if you will, are the pawns, which means it's time to talk about those. So if you're unfamiliar with this system, basically instead of traveling with a party of other people, you travel with their pawns. Your party is made up of you, your main pawn, which is always with you, and then 2 extra pawns. These can either be generic pawns filled in by Capcom themselves if you're playing with your network turned off, or if that is not the case, they can be pawns from other players. At rift stones scattered throughout the land, you can pick these characters up, though they do share a few differences between your main pawn. Your main pawn is going to level up and be customized with you. Other characters' pawns will not level up, which means you'll have to change them out occasionally if you want them to be effective. What's more though, and the biggest feature from the previous game, is that as these pawns go on adventures with other Arisen, they pick up on what happened. They learn about the environment, the quests that they've completed and gone on, the fights they get into, tactics you may have not tried. And so when you bring these pawns along, they'll often shout messages that can lead you to things they know about or point you in the right direction for a quest, as an example. Now, Dragon's Dogma 2 takes this a little bit farther and adds specializations and quests. It's possible for pawns to pick up a specialization. For instance, the probably most notable one really is that your character does not speak Elvish, which means if you want to interact with the elves of Sacred Arbor, you need a pawn that does. But they can also do other things like reveal the location of crafting material hubs on your map, and other useful things. Though these specializations will tend to make your pawn act a little more independently, which isn't necessarily always a good thing, because they might just behave a little unpredictably. Whenever you hire a pawn to take with you, it might also come with a quest. Basically, if you do this thing with that pawn, you'll get a small reward from the person whose pawn that is. Pawns can also earn badges and things like that to make interacting with them fun. Now, the reason you might want to interact with this system is that the reward is Rift Crystals. Rift Crystals are needed to hire pawns that are higher level than you, as anything above your own level costs an increasing amount of these Rift Crystals, but they can also be spent on helping to customize your pawn. Your pawn comes with their own personality and things that you set when you make them, but that can also be customized and changed later with items that will affect all of this, which you can buy at the Pawn Guild and major hubs. So the more people use your particular pawn, the more Rift Crystals you'll gain and the more you can spend and interact with that system a bit. So overall, I would say pawns are a bit better than they were in Dragon's Dogma 1, and it's a relatively novel system, period, as you don't really see it anywhere else. And how those pawns learn and change and respond to the people they've been running around with, I think is pretty cool, and that remains the case here. Which brings us to the gameplay and world section of the game, and you're going to be spending a lot of time running around this world if you play it to its full, so it's a good thing to know about. Now, I will say right away that in the marketing they were talking about how this world was 4 times bigger than the original, but that's not really saying much because the map for the original one was very, very small. I would say that the open world for this game is also not very big, but it is definitely a lot bigger than the original, which is important when we talk about fast travel here in a bit. Now, the world itself is divided up primarily into 2 areas, Vermund and Batal. Vermund is this sort of sweeping grassland, foresty areas with the occasional mountainous feel to it, whereas Batal is this rocky, sandy, almost desert-esque area. You're free to explore and go as you will, and while there are occasional gates to places farther in, you can work your way around those if you learn about them. And the open world is dynamic. Every character you run into in major hubs is a set character with a name, and outside of town hubs, they have NPCs wandering around, they can get in trouble with monsters, and you'll also see pawns wandering the roads as well. And this makes the entire world feel a bit lively, especially when you look at things like the ox cart system, which at certain times of day, the ox cart will go from one end of the map to the other. And if you run into one, either by waiting on it at its starting location or just out in the wild, you can hop on and fast travel to wherever it's going if you pay a small fee. So things like that add to the world feeling a bit more alive. Now, each of these NPCs you run into has an affinity with your character, which is just how much they like you, which can lead to them doing things like giving you gifts at your home, which you can purchase in Vermund, and some of those interactions can be humorous. It also plays into the end a tiny bit. Now, because each of these NPCs is their own personality and everything, and the fact that some of them are directly tied to quests, you might be wondering if you can kill them, and the answer is yes. However, some of them being tied to quests means you might break something, and that's where the morgues or the charnel houses come in. Using an item called a wake stone, which you can also use on yourself in combat if you die, you can revive these dead NPCs. If you've left the area where they died, they'll eventually be moved to the morgue and you can go find them, revive them, and then carry on with whatever quest it is they had for you. Now, if you go massacring a town, you can, of course, expect the guards to react accordingly, though depending on how powerful you are, maybe that doesn't really matter. And a lot of stuff like that leads to a dynamic feeling world, especially in the main hub areas. And it's a shame shame, I think, that they didn't involve more interesting side content as a result. The game does not have a lot of fulfilling side quests that would have utilized this system, which means while all of that stuff I mentioned is cool, it can feel a little paper thin at times. Now let's talk about getting around this world, or fast travel. Broadly speaking, I actually like the improvements they've made from the original title here. The original ones saw you gathering port crystals, dropping them at certain areas around the map, and then using a separate item called a fairy stone to travel there. The second title has port crystals in specific locations on the map, and if you find and interact with them, you can fast travel to that area at any time without having to find and move a port crystal on your own. However, the port crystals are also in the game as an item for you to pick up, and you can do what you did in the first game. So there are set locations where there are permanent ones, and then there are also optional ones that you can pick up and go drop somewhere, and then you use your fairy stones to travel in between them. Fairy stones are a little more uncommon than I would have preferred, which leads to a lot of running around, but this system combined with the ox cart system, which is also fast travel, gives you plenty of ways to move around the map once you learn about what and how. And I think that's a reasonable compromise from the original title's method, which is probably necessary because of how much larger this world is than the original one. Now that's more of a, I would say, functional breakdown. Let's talk about the other side of it, the gameplay portion of running around this world. Mostly you're going to be running around, fighting enemies as you go, taking on the occasional side quest, and that looks pretty much like what you would expect. You're just running around, fighting monsters and interacting with them, though it does have some dynamic elements. There are parts of the world that can be broken, such as destructible bridges and things, that after a few days in-game will eventually respawn. Also helps with that sort of dynamic feeling. There are also all sorts of optional dungeons and things you can find throughout the world, and the world itself has a day-night cycle, the night cycle in particular being very, very dark. You can obviously change this a bit with your brightness settings, but it's intended to be very low vision. And also, more dangerous enemies come out at night. And this can lead to a few fun secrets to find, such as the Headless Horseman fight or the Sphinx. Now, I will say the Sphinx is very well tucked away, but because this game has been out a little while already, it's very easy to find via guides. I'm not going to show it personally because YouTube is not a fan of nudity. But my point being, there's secrets and things to interact with on the map that the first game kind of lacked. But I will say also that Batal in particular has way too many enemies. You cannot move in the areas of Batal without just tripping over enemy after enemy. That makes it hard to move anywhere, and for a game that limits fast travel, I think they could have culled the enemy density a little bit there. Obviously, you want it to be a bit dangerous because that's the kind of world we're dealing with here, but when I can't walk like 5 steps without tripping over enemies in one section of the map in particular, you probably need to take a second look at it. The second one fight is over, you're immediately thrown into another one, and it gets very annoying very fast, especially if you're just trying to walk somewhere, because even the regular old road is not safe. Whereas the other part of the map, Vermund, where you start, it's a little more spaced out and you don't run into that issue as often. All of that said though, as I mentioned, not a fan of the side content in this game. I don't think the game has a lot of compelling quests or anything to go deal with, and while there are certainly quests, most of them are just very generic fetch quests or go kill this specific monster or escort this person. And it's interesting to me that they built and made this really dynamic world with this NPC system, the death system, the affinity system, and then they did basically nothing with it. Most of the interesting quests are tied to the main story, with just a couple of interesting side quests. Most of it was pretty boring. And while that's not a surprise given the big focus on combat and everything, it's still a bit of a shame to see. Nonetheless though, moving through the world, interacting with its denizens, fighting off monsters, camping out in the wilderness is a decent enough experience. That though brings me to the combat section. Now, largely speaking, this is just the combat from Dragon's Dogma 1. In fact, I would argue that this is probably where they changed the least, and given that it's the bulk of what the game is, if you've played the original title, you should feel right at home here. Many of the vocations, their skills, etc. is just pulled directly from the original title. Even the enemies, how you approach them, their weak spots, which I will say does lead to a few instances where I think they played it too close to the original title. In fact, outside of a couple vocations that you're not going to get until the late game, it feels nearly identical, which I don't think is great for a sequel. You want to improve, not just make the same thing. More broadly speaking though, combat is stat-based with a bit of skill. So there are action elements to this. You obviously need to know what skills to use when. You need to know when to swing, when to block if you're playing a fighter, or how to use your vocation's special ability. So it does absolutely have a skill threshold, but there is also a stat threshold like I mentioned way earlier. There's going to be a breakpoint with your stats that you're just better than everything else you're running into, which is going to make combat much easier for you. Enemies, though, I would say can be divided up into small versus big. Small enemies are just kind of human-sized things, really, that you'll fight off in a pretty standard manner, utilizing the skills available to you. These are things like actual humanoid bandits, the undead, goblins of their many size and varieties, these lizard people called saurians, and each of them has their little unique things. For instance, you can cut off a saurian's tail. Bandits come in all forms that you have, basically mage, archer, thief, etc., which can lead to some dynamic fights, but mostly these characters are pretty easy to mow down. Then you have the big enemies, the enemies that you need to climb and grapple and hit in specific locations to deal the most damage, as they tend to have very large health bars with multiple instances of said health bar. Most of these big enemies are also pulled directly from Dragon's Dogma 1, so if you know how to fight them there, you know how to fight them here. It works identically. The main exception being a couple of dragon types introduced in the very late game. Generally though, big enemies you want to grapple, find their weak spot, and hit it. At the time it was released, grappling and climbing up these enemies and hitting specific portions of them was pretty novel, but as this is a sequel, it's not exactly breaking new ground, but it is still pretty fun to mess around with, and that grapple and throw system can lead to many a funny moment. I will say, though, that enemy variety is not great. You're mostly going to be fighting the same things constantly, and for a game that is all about combat, I think that's a real bummer. And given that most of these monsters and things are just pulled directly from the original, it really doesn't feel like they added much in terms of enemy variety. It feels like they didn't do much new here at all, really. But luckily, the combat itself is pretty fun. Now, as you're engaging in combat and take enemy hits, you will build up what they call your loss gauge, which is basically just a reduction of your max health. And obviously that makes you less effective in combat. So in order to replenish your health up to its actual maximum, you can rest, which will restore this, which is what incentivizes you to camp or go to an inn every once in a while, which is usually where your pawn will report back any travels with other people. From a more functional standpoint, depending on your vocation, a little bit of this will change, but your basic attack is obviously just that, a basic attack that doesn't eat stamina. Every character does have a stamina bar, which is what they're going to use to activate their special abilities based on their vocation. Which brings us to the vocations. I mostly just want to talk about the new stuff here because a lot of this is actually just repeats from the original, and there isn't much to say that isn't immediately obvious. So I'll sum it up very quickly. Outside of the 4 starter vocations, which we discussed earlier, there are 2 advanced vocations, Warrior and Sorcerer. These are different vocations entirely from the starter. They are not strictly better. For instance, the melee version sees you charging up melee attacks and can deal incredible damage, but is very slow and lacks some of the defensive features from the Fighter vocation. Sorcerer does fantastic charge up AoE abilities that can debilitate enemy foes and hit large groups. The downside here being that they lose access to their healing magic and buffs for your party, which is a very basic example of how every single vocation is different. There is not a singularly better vocation, simply which one suits your playstyle better. Now what's especially interesting are the new vocations that they brought in, such as the Trickster or the Wayfarer, that are a bit different than their counterparts in their entirety. Trickster is more of a support-oriented vocation where you don't deal damage directly, but you'll have the ability to get specters and things summoned in that can deal damage or distract enemies, that kind of thing. Generally, I like the concept of Trickster. Actually playing it wasn't really my thing. And then you have something like the Wayfarer. The Wayfarer is able to equip weapons from every other vocation, but has lower base stats as a result. Pretty much your standard can do everything, but less effectively than someone who is specialized. And everything I just mentioned combines to make a combat system that is a lot of fun. It feels great, just like the original did, jumping onto enemies, hacking away at their weak spots, or just dominating little enemies through a use of interesting party comps and min-maxed builds using your augments and stat growth charts, if you will, if you want to take it that far, though it's not necessary at all, leads to a combat system that is as engaging and min-maxy as you want it to be, or if you prefer, as simple and straightforward as a general hack and slash. And in that way, the combat of this game is very versatile. I really just wish they had given us more enemies to fight and that the enemy density in certain areas was toned down a little bit. Because there does come a point, for me it was around 10 to 20 hours, where a lot of fights were just like a nuisance and in the way more than they were an engaging experience. But the overall system is pretty fun. Now, moving right along, let's finally talk about the microtransactions of this particular title. I have a few things to say here, but I want to kick this section off with this. All of the microtransactions are things that can be acquired in-game. I would not generally consider any of them pay to win, but what a lot of them are pay for convenience, which I still don't think is great. I also don't think $70 full-price AAA games should be shipping with microtransactions to make things easier to accommodate for systems that the game developer already made. So, as an example, one of the things you can buy are port crystals, which enable an extra form of fast travel beyond what you'd be able to get normally, which means you're paying for a convenience option. And while you absolutely don't need those things, that existing incentivizes the developer to develop those things to give you a reason to buy them. For the most basic example, I don't need to buy port crystals if I have access to free and abundant fast travel. They've effectively created a problem so they can sell you the solution to it. And I think things like that are exceptionally unfortunate because realistically, this game has an online component via its pawn system. If you were to tell me, hey, here's some cosmetic microtransactions because we have to support the cost of these servers over time, that's perfectly reasonable. I wouldn't really have any problem with that. But these pay-for-convenience options effectively just help people get around the system you as a developer designed to begin with aren't great, and I don't like seeing them in these games. I also, though, have seen a lot of, I would say, misinformation about them. They are definitely not pay to win, and everything about them can be obtained in-game. You can edit your character's appearance at barber shops around town, but that costs gold, and you would be incentivized to buy something that lets you do that because you can't just create a new character or start a new game at the moment. And while, yes, you can absolutely just get the gold to go do it, and it's not that crazy expensive either, you can see what I'm talking about when I've said that they've tried to push people into those purchases through these design decisions. So while these microtransactions don't bother me as much as, say, the performance issues do, I also still don't think they should be here. And it's really easy to say, yeah, well, just don't buy them. And that is the correct thing to do. You definitely shouldn't buy them. You don't need them. They become an issue when the game starts being developed around them. So while they are not nearly as bad as some of the initial rumors and speculation I saw running around the internet, I still don't think they should be here at all, just on principle. That, though, brings me to the Steam Deck section of this particular review, and generally I would say don't. You're going to run into some problems potentially, not least of which because of how demanding this game is, which is a little beyond what a Steam Deck can generally pull off anyway. Another portion is that this game uses anti-cheat software, both Denuvo and Enigma, I believe, which is a problem specifically because the Steam Deck is a Linux-based system, and sometimes Linux-based systems will trigger those anti-cheat things as some sort of third-party software, which can be a problem if you want to play with the network features enabled specifically. So while you could probably play this on the Steam Deck, simply put, I personally wouldn't, especially if you're playing it online with the pawn system enabled, because if you tinker with any of the settings for the Steam Deck, like the exact version of Proton you're using to get around some of the performance issues the game has, suddenly you might find yourself banned. So a pretty bad time all around. That, though, brings me to our positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. Now, on the positive side of things, I like what they did with the dynamic elements of the world, the NPCs, the affinity systems, the ability to either kill or resurrect them, and generally just exploring around and seeing what the world had to offer in terms of beautiful vistas, set pieces, and stuff was really cool, even if it is let down by a lack of side content in any meaningful way. Combat itself, also very good, no surprise there, it's the core focus of the game, so it better be good, to be honest. And it is, very much so. It's a very good experience. I think they took the original, improved upon it, if nonetheless playing it a bit safe. But the world is cool, and the combat is a lot of fun. But then we have the negatives, which are a bit on the hefty side for me. The performance, obviously, is not great, and while that might be patched eventually, right now it is what it is. I also think the story was incredibly poor. I didn't go into it expecting some grand reimagining of the entire universe because, again, I know how Dragon's Dogma 1 works, I know how that panned out, But the story for this game is just not good, in my opinion. I was not impressed. Most of it doesn't matter at all. And then that leads to some, in my opinion, truly terrible writing towards the end. There's the lack of good side content. Most of the quests and everything just aren't that interesting. There's not a ton of it to begin with. Most of it is front-loaded. And while there's a couple of decent quests in there, none of it's going to blow you away, and I was really let down since that was also the case for the first game. I was hoping they would expand upon and really dive into the universe a bit, which just didn't happen. Then there's the lack of enemy variety. Most of this stuff is just pulled directly from the first game and works identically. And all of those things together really made me feel like this was more of like an anniversary edition or a remaster or something to the original rather than a full-blown new game. Which brings me to my conclusion. Dragon's Dogma 2 has its good moments. There are times I was having a lot of fun with it. I think in many ways it is a step up from the original title and improves on some pretty key features, but it's also a game that has some pretty glaring negatives, even if you ignore the microtransaction stuff, which I am entirely for the sake of this conclusion. Let's pretend those microtransactions don't exist at all. I'm stuck with a game with performance issues, a poor story, lack of engaging side content, poor enemy variety, and speaking for myself at least, that's just not a game I would pay full price for. And while I didn't get a review copy of this, I actually did get gifted a pre-order of it for Christmas, because this was one of my most anticipated games this year, and needless to say, I'm a bit disappointed in it, frankly, because for all its good moments and the times I was having fun, I think it's outweighed by the negatives. So, as a recommendation, I would personally say wait a couple months, buy it preferably on sale when they get some of the most egregious problems cleaned up. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular review. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found the video informative. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know how you feel about all of these things down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.